Chapter 4 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Barnes. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 4. King Arthur of Britain. More than 14 centuries ago, there lived in the island of Britain a very wise king named Uther Pendragon, and at his court there dwelt an enchanter of great art, whose name was Merlin. Now Merlin, among his other arts, had the power of seeing into the future, and what he could not prevent he could often foretell. And looking forward with this art of his, Merlin saw that after the death of King Uther there would be war and confusion in Britain, and the only one who could save the land would be the king's son, Arthur. But Merlin knew that the king would not live very long, and that Arthur was too weak to govern as a child. Nay more, that unless Arthur were concealed he would be murdered by the noblemen that sought to obtain the kingdom. So he told this to King Uther, and they agreed to hide the child and have him reared in secret. And for this purpose they gave him to a nobleman named Sir Hector de Bonmaison, who was possessed of a good heart, telling him that the child, though of noble blood, was no better than a waif whose parents were both dead. Everything that Merlin foresaw then came to pass. King Uther Pendragon died, and war and confusion seized Britain. For 18 years there was no peace or safety in the land, and at the end of this time the people were weary of bloodshed, and sought a king who should govern them with a strong hand. Merlin was known to be the wisest man in the entire land, if not in all the world, and the Archbishop of Canterbury came to him and sought advice concerning a worthy king for Britain. And Merlin, thinking of Arthur, prepared by enchantment a test whereby the rightful king of Britain should be known. In front of the cathedral there appeared a great block of marble with an anvil upon it, and into the anvil was thrust a great bright sword that shone full as brilliantly as the stars themselves. And on the handle of the sword was a legend saying that whosoever could draw the sword from the anvil was the rightful king of Britain. A mighty tournament was then proclaimed, and after the tournament all the nobles were to attempt to draw out the sword from the anvil. All the great men in the land were to be present, and the one who drew the sword was to be proclaimed as king. Sir Hector de Bonmaison went to the tournament, and with him went his rightful son Sir Kay, and the boy Arthur. Sir Kay was a powerful knight, famous in war, and he intended to win the tournament for the credit of his house. And it seemed as if he would indeed succeed, for with his sword he struck down all that were opposed to him, until the sword snapped and left him without a weapon. Then Sir Kay called Arthur to his side, and bade the boy get him another sword, and quickly. And Arthur, who knew nothing about the sword in front of the cathedral, except that he had seen it there, ran to that spot and sprang upon the marble block, and when he pulled upon the haft of the sword it came forth from the iron block into his hand as easily as though it had been thrust into a pat of butter, and with it he ran to Sir Kay. But Sir Kay, when he saw it, looked strangely upon Arthur, and bade the lad say straightway where he had obtained it. And when Sir Kay heard how Arthur had pulled it from the anvil, he fought no more, for an evil scheme had come into his mind. And going to his father, he said that he himself had drawn the sword from the anvil, and so must be the rightful king of Britain. Marvelling greatly, Sir Hector, with Arthur and Sir Kay, went to the cathedral, and Sir Kay tried to thrust the sword back into the metal, but could not do it. Then Arthur took the sword, and thrust it in as easily as though the iron were soft earth. And for all his efforts Sir Kay could not draw it forth again. But Arthur drew it forth, and thrust it back, and then did so once more. And at this Sir Hector knew that the child whom he had reared was no other than the son of King Uther Pendragon, and kneeling at Arthur's feet, both he and Sir Kay offered him their homage. And then all the nobles and the kings and the great men in the land gathered about the cathedral, and tried one after one to draw the sword, and none could stir it. But Arthur drew the sword so easily that he needed but lay one hand upon the hilt to have it come into his grasp, and after much amazement and doubt and further trials, the people of Britain proclaimed Arthur as their king. It was soon seen that this lad, who had been reared in obscurity and was hitherto unknown, was to be a greater king than even his father had been before him. For Arthur quelled the wars that had been ravaging the country, and brought justice and peace to all the land. And those that rose against him he punished with a hand of iron. But all the people loved the young king, who was knightly and chivalrous, and the fame of his deeds rang through his dominions. For in all Britain there was no knight better than he with sword and lance, no surer horseman or bolder warrior than the king himself. And for a time he conducted himself according to the fashion of noble knights, and rode abroad combating evil and conquering all those who sought to oppose him. Everywhere that Arthur went, the enchanter Merlin watched over him, and on more than one occasion Merlin saved his life. And the wise old man, with his enchanter's art, looked into the future, and saw where Arthur would gain the strength and power that has made his name live down to the present day, aye, and that will make it shine long after those who read this book are laid away in their own tombs and forgotten. Merlin knew that in a certain lake that lay in a land of enchantment in Arthur's dominions there was a marvellous sword called Excalibur, possessed of such great power that all those who fought against it must fall, while in the scabbard of the sword there rested the healing virtue that nobody who wore it could ever be wounded or lose any blood in battle. Many knights had tried to gain this sword, but a terrible fate had befallen them without exception, for nobody could claim it who was not true at heart, and who knew not the meaning of the word fear. The sword itself was held in a mighty arm that uplifted itself from the centre of the lake, and this arm was clothed in the purest white, marvellous to look upon. Merlin took Arthur to the edge of the lake, and the king beheld the great arm holding the sword above the water, and when he saw it he was possessed of the desire to have it for his own, for the blade gleamed like the sunlight, the handle was bright with the purest gold and jewels, and there seemed to be a greater strength and a lustre in it than the work of mortal hands could bring about. While the king with Merlin stood at the edge of the lake and wondered how it would be possible to obtain the sword, all of a sudden a barge appeared in the shape of a beautiful white swan. In it stood a radiant lady, clad all in green, with white pearls in her hair, and pearls like drops of weeping mist all over her garments, which themselves appeared like woven and intermingled rushes. The boat made its way through the water without motive power, until it grated gently on the sands where Arthur and Merlin were standing. And the lady spoke to Arthur, and told him that she was no other than the Lady of the Lake, and that the sword Excalibur should be his own. And Arthur stepped into the boat, which promptly left the shore, and glided straight as an arrow to the place where the sword appeared. Although the king had never felt fear in his life, he felt a wonder approaching to fear at the mystic white hand that grasped the handle of Excalibur so firmly. But leaning from the boat, he took the sword, and the hand at once disappeared in the waters of the lake. and due to Merlin's gifts of magic, Arthur himself was able to look into the future at that time and see one thing, namely, that when his reign was over, and he himself sore wounded and near to death, he must return Excalibur to the hand that gave it to him, casting it back into the lake before he died. With Excalibur at his side, Arthur was invincible in war, and he struck down all that opposed him. But he was so chivalrous that he never used the sword except against the wicked, and from that time on forbore to do any battle in the way of sport, but fought only against his enemies. King Arthur had beheld a lady named Guinevere at Cameliard, and was smitten with love for her, and desired to make her his bride. But first of all he wished to be near her, and he asked Merlin to furnish him with some disguise by which he might accomplish this without her knowledge. Merlin agreed, and gave Arthur a cap on which he had cast a spell. For when Arthur put it on, he appeared to be no longer a king, but a simple gardener's boy. On pain of discovery, however, he must always wear the cap, for when he took it off he showed himself once more as Arthur the king. So Arthur went to Cameliard, disguised as a gardener's boy, and he sought work in the castle grounds, where he might often behold the Lady Guinevere. And for some days he worked in the gardens, while she walked there, and looked upon her to his heart's content, and every time he saw her she seemed to be more beautiful than before. One morning, however, while he was bathing at the fountain with his cap laid aside, the Lady Guinevere looked out of the window and saw him. She did not know he was the king, she only knew that a very handsome knight was bathing at her fountain. But in a trice the king put on his cap again, and became the gardener's boy, who said that none had been there save himself. At last, however, Arthur was discovered by Guinevere, although even then she knew not that he was the king. And after this had happened, he went forth on a quest in her behalf, and overcame 4 knights, whom he sent to her as his captives, with orders to serve her and do what she desired. These knights were well known to Arthur, and were his friends, but like Guinevere they had not known him, because he kept down the visor of his helmet when he did battle with them, and they returned and told Guinevere that they were conquered by an unknown knight, who had ordered them to come to her and do her bidding. Guinevere was guarded in the castle of Cameliard by a knight named Sir Mordaunt of Northumber, who was great desirous of wedding her, and at last he kept her a close prisoner, and with 6 champions mounted guard before the castle, proclaiming that unless some champions came forward in her behalf, he would marry her against her will. At this Guinevere was greatly distressed, for she had grown to love the unknown knight that she had seen in the garden, and she asked the 4 that were in her charge to go forth and do battle with the knights that guarded her. But they would not, although they were bound to do her word, because they were angered that she should demand this of them, when she knew that they were only 4 against 7. When Arthur returned, however, he placed himself at their head, and they charged the 7 knights so fiercely that 3 were slain in their onslaught, and the others fled. And shortly after this, Guinevere was brought to Arthur for marriage, and he disclosed his state as king, and their nuptials were celebrated with gorgeous pomp and ceremony. Merlin told Arthur to ask from Guinevere's father, whose name was Leodegrance, and who was himself a king, a marvellous round table that he possessed. This table had magic powers, said Merlin, and Arthur would add greatly to the strength of his kingdom by possessing it. The table had many marvellous properties, and the chairs that went with it were equally marvellous. The names of those who should sit in them appeared in letters of gold when such knights approached, and disappeared again when they rose to depart. There was also a seat richer than the rest for the king himself, and another chair wonderfully carven and wrought with gems, that was called the Seat Perilous, where even Arthur might not sit. For that chair was reserved for the knight who should look upon the Holy Grail, a vessel containing the blood of Christ that had been taken to heaven on his death. It could only be beheld by the purest knight that went in quest of it, which Arthur could not do, because he must rule his kingdom. Then Arthur gathered all the best knights in the realm about him, and they were called the Knights of the Round Table, and they bound themselves by vows to noble deeds and gallant conduct, to redress wrongs, to think no evil, or allow it to appear in any guise at the Round Table. And through the deeds of his Knights of the Round Table, Arthur's name became even greater in his kingdom than it had ever been before. But little by little, doubt and suspicion began to appear among Arthur's knights, and these were fostered by the evil plots of Arthur's nephew, Mordred. Above all, Mordred hated a knight named Sir Lancelot, who, with the exception of the king, was the bravest knight in Britain. Sir Lancelot was loved by Queen Guinevere, and loved her in return. And through Mordred's schemes it befell that fighting commenced between Lancelot and other knights of the Round Table, in which many were slain. And then the whole kingdom of Britain was torn apart, and Arthur's former glory was lost. And at last the unhappy king even found himself at war with his former friend, Sir Lancelot himself, who had stolen the love of the queen. After bitter fighting, Sir Lancelot went back to his own country of Brittany, taking Queen Guinevere with him beyond the sea, and Arthur pursued him there. And while Arthur was laying siege to Sir Lancelot's castle, the false knight Mordred rose against Arthur in his own country, hatching a rebellion against the king. So Arthur had to give up the siege of Lancelot's castle and return to Britain to fight against the traitors that had risen from the ranks of his own subjects. This was the last war that Arthur ever engaged in. Merlin had foretold that when the seats at the Round Table had all been filled, Arthur's kingdom must gradually decline. The seats had been filled long since, and the decline had come about through the distrust and the evil deeds of Arthur's own knights. And now he must fight a number of them, both in the ranks of Lancelot and under the banner of Mordred. In a battle with Mordred's forces, King Arthur's army fought so fiercely that when dusk fell, almost all the men on both sides who had engaged in that fight were slain, and none were left but the leaders of the opposing forces. And Arthur engaged in personal combat with Mordred just as the sun was going down. Now Arthur had long since lost the scabbard of his sword Excalibur, so it was possible to wound or slay him in battle, although he that stood up against the stroke of that sword must also be slain. And this very thing came to pass in Arthur's battle with Mordred, for as Arthur ran him through, Mordred struck him so terrible a blow on the head that his helmet was cut in two, and the sword sank deep in his skull. Grievously wounded, Arthur was carried from the field by one of his few remaining knights, named Sir Bedivere. And Arthur, seeing that he must die, gave to Sir Bedivere the sword Excalibur, telling him to throw it into the lake. When Sir Bedivere approached the shore of the mysterious lake, which lay not far from the spot where Arthur had been wounded, his heart misgave him at throwing away so beautiful and magical a sword. Therefore he hid the sword in the rushes, and returned to the dying king, telling him that he had done as was commanded. But Arthur did not believe him, and asked him what he had seen when Excalibur sank beneath the waves. And Bedivere told him that he had seen nothing except the rippling of the water under the wind, and the rustle of the reeds at the margin of the lake. And Arthur told Sir Bedivere to return and do as he had been commanded, for the king knew well that he had been deceived. Once again Sir Bedivere returned to the lake, and once again he came back to Arthur with a lying tale that he had obeyed the King's commands. Then Arthur, in high anger, commanded him to deceive a dying man no longer, and Sir Bedivere at last went back and threw Excalibur into the lake. As Excalibur hurtled through the air and approached the water, a great hand arose from the depths and caught it by the hilt, waved it thrice in the air, and vanished beneath the waves. And Sir Bedivere returned to Arthur and told him what he had seen. Then Arthur knew that Sir Bedivere had indeed spoken the truth, and the dying king put one more command upon him, namely, to bear him to the shore of the lake where he had thrown Excalibur. As they approached the shore, a barge was seen cleaving the water without visible motive power, and on the barge, which was draped all in black, were 4 damsels who wept bitterly. When the prow of the barge reached the shore, Arthur commanded Sir Bedivere to lay him on it, and at once it moved out into the mists of the lake with the black-robed figures bending over the king. And Arthur called out to Sir Bedivere in farewell, telling him that he was going to Avalon either to die or to be healed of his grievous wound, and he asked Sir Bedivere to pray for his immortal soul. From that day Arthur was not seen again, although many believed that he would come back and rescue his countrymen when dangers beset them, and today the legends of Arthur leave it doubtful if he will return or not. But the great king, as well as the realm that he ruled over, have been lost forever in the mists of time, and the story of Arthur is ended. End of chapter 4.